A few minutes before 9 on the morning of the 6th of December 1917, a railway telegraph operator in Halifax, Nova Scotia, makes a decision that will be studied for as long as his profession exists. His name is Vince Coleman. He is 45 years old, a dispatcher for the Canadian Government Railways, and he works in a small wooden office at the Richmond Railway Yards, a few hundred feet from the harbour. Through his window, he can see a ship on fire in the channel called the Narrows. She is drifting toward the Richmond piers, burning fiercely, throwing barrels into the air, and a sailor sent running up from the waterfront has just told him what almost no one else on shore knows. The ship is loaded with high explosives, and when the fire reaches them, she will not simply burn. Coleman and the chief clerk beside him start to leave with everyone else. Then Coleman remembers the trains. An overnight passenger train from St. John, New Brunswick, is due into the city within minutes, coming down the track that runs along the waterfront, straight past the burning ship. Hundreds of passengers. He goes back to his key. The message he taps out is remembered in a few slightly different forms, because the men down the line who received it wrote it down from memory afterward. Its substance is not in doubt. Hold up the train. A munition ship is on fire in the harbour and is making for the pier. Goodbye, boys. At 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9, the French freighter Mont-Blanc detonates. The blast is the largest human-made explosion the world has ever produced, and it will keep that title for 28 years until the atomic age opens in a New Mexico desert. It levels more than a square mile of the city in a fraction of a second. It kills roughly 1,800 people, injures 9,000, and blinds dozens of the people who stood at their windows to watch the fire. It throws half a ton of the ship's anchor more than 2 miles. Vince Coleman is killed at his key. The trains are stopped. This is the file on the morning a war being fought an ocean away arrived, in one instant, in a Canadian harbour city. The 2 ships, the 10 minutes of bad navigation, the 20 minutes of fire, the blast itself, and the buried city, and the blizzard that followed it, and the long argument in 3 courts over who was to blame for the deadliest disaster in Canadian history. Halifax exists because of its harbour, and in 1917 that harbour was one of the most important places in the British war effort. The geography explains everything that follows, so hold the map in your mind. The open Atlantic leads into a broad outer harbour guarded by an island fort. At the inner end, the water pinches into a strait about a mile long and at its tightest, well under half a mile wide. It is called the Narrows. The city of Halifax rises steeply on its western side. The town of Dartmouth faces it from the east. At the Dartmouth waterline sat Turtle Grove, a small Micmac community that had been there far longer than either town. Beyond the Narrows, the water opens into Bedford Basin, a deep, sheltered anchorage large enough to hide a fleet from the ocean entirely. Hiding fleets was exactly its wartime job. By the winter of 1917, the German submarine campaign had forced Allied shipping into convoys, and Halifax was where the slow convoys assembled. Merchant ships gathered in Bedford Basin by the dozen, coaled and watered, and sailed for Europe together under escort. Troop ships left from here, hospital ships returned here. The population had swollen with soldiers, sailors and dockyard workers, and the north end of the city, the working district called Richmond that faced the Narrows, was full of the families who did the work. Railwaymen, stevedores, factory hands, their children enrolled in the schools on the slope above the piers. The harbour mouth was closed every night by anti-submarine nets. They opened at dawn, which meant every morning began with a queue, ships that had waited all night to enter, ships in the basin cleared to leave, all funneling through the same mile of water in the first hours of daylight, past a city on either side. There were rules for that water, and they were old, written and simple. A ship keeps to the starboard side of the channel, her own right-hand side. Oncoming ships pass each other port to port, left shoulder to left shoulder, the same convention as traffic on a road. Harbour speed was limited to 5 knots. Movements in and out were supervised by the Royal Canadian Navy through an officer called the Chief Examining Officer, Acting Commander Frederick Wyatt, whose job was to know what every arriving ship carried and to control when she moved. The rules assumed everyone followed them. On the morning of the 6th of December, in the space of about 10 minutes, the Narrows would see improvisation instead, and one of the ships improvising had no margin at all for it, because she was, by any honest description, a floating bomb. The Mont-Blanc was a French general cargo steamer, 320 feet long, 25 years old, worn, slow, and unremarkable in every way except for what had just been put inside her. She was loaded at New York in the last days of November for a war economy that was consuming explosives faster than ships could carry them. The stevedores who loaded her worked under unusual discipline. The holds were lined with wooden partitions, and the men driving the nails used copper ones because copper does not spark. Into those holds went about 2,300 tons of picric acid, the shell-filling explosive of the day, along with roughly 200 tons of TNT and 10 tons of guncotton. Then, because the French purchasing agents wanted every cubic foot used, several hundred barrels of benzol, a high-octane motor fuel, were stacked 3 and 4 high on her open deck and lashed down, close to 3,000 tons of explosives and fuel in one hull. Her crew were forbidden matches, her galley fire was restricted, her engine room burned coal beneath a cargo that a single spark could reach. She had been meant to join a convoy at New York, but her tired engines could not hold convoy speed, so she was ordered up the coast alone to Halifax, to sail instead with the next slow convoy assembling in Bedford Basin. She arrived off the harbour on the evening of the 5th of December, too late for the nets, and anchored outside for the night. Early on the 6th, she took aboard a Halifax harbour pilot, Francis Mackey, a man with 24 years of local experience and no accidents against his name. The examination officers cleared her, and Commander Wyatt's office now knew what she carried. She started in through the harbour toward the basin, low in the water, at half speed. One safeguard of the old peacetime world did not sail with her. Before the war, a ship carrying explosives flew a red flag, and the whole harbour knew to give her room. In wartime, that flag had become intelligence for any watching periscope, and the practice had been dropped. So the Mont-Blanc came up the harbour, looking exactly like any other shabby tramp steamer, and beyond the pilot, the examination staff, and the naval office, almost no one in Halifax knew what was in her. The secrecy that was meant to protect her would, within the hour, cost the watchers on shore more than any flag ever could. The other ship was the Imo, a Norwegian-flagged steamer chartered by the Commission for Relief in Belgium, the neutral organization feeding German-occupied Belgium. She was an old White Star cargo liner, launched in England in 1889, longer than the Mont-Blanc by more than 100 feet, and she was running empty, in ballast, riding high out of the water, bound for New York to load relief supplies. Her sides carried the words, Belgian Relief in letters tall enough to read across the harbour, her safe conduct against submarines. She had meant to sail on the 5th, but her coal was delivered late, the nets closed, and she spent an unplanned night in Bedford Basin with her captain, Hakon From, a day behind schedule and known to be unhappy about it. On the morning of the 6th, she weighed anchor with pilot William Hayes on her bridge, and came down the basin toward the Narrows, outbound, making up time. Witnesses would put her speed well above the harbour limit. 2 ships, then, in the funnel at the same hour. One inbound, low and slow, loaded with 3,000 tons of explosives that almost nobody knew about. One outbound, high and empty and in a hurry. What happened next took less than half an hour, and courts would argue about it for 3 years. The Narrows that morning were busy, and the Emo's run down the channel was never clean. Coming out of the basin, she met an American tramp steamer inbound on the wrong side of the channel. The 2 bridges agreed by whistle to pass starboard to starboard, an irregular passing that carried the Imo over toward the Dartmouth side, the wrong side for an outbound ship. Almost immediately, she met more traffic. The harbour tug Stella Maris, coming up the Narrows towing 2 scows, saw the Imo bearing down on her at what her officers judged to be an unusual speed, and hauled toward the Halifax shore to give her room. The Imo held the Dartmouth side rather than cut back across. Remember the Stella Maris. This file is not finished with her. None of this was yet dangerous. It simply meant that when the Imo and the Mont-Blanc finally sighted each other down the length of the Narrows, each ship was roughly in the other's water, closing head-on at a combined walking pace. The Mont-Blanc, inbound along the Dartmouth shore where the rules said she should be, had the right to expect the channel ahead of her to be clear. Pilot Mackey sighted the Imo fine on his port bow, coming down on a line that made no sense to him. There followed the exchange of whistle signals that every court would pick over, blast by blast. The Mont-Blanc sounded one short blast. "I am holding my course to starboard toward Dartmouth." The Imo answered with 2. "I am holding mine to port," which kept her in the Mont-Blanc's water. Mackey edged closer to the Dartmouth shore and signaled again. Again, the Imo answered with 2 blasts. Aboard the Mont-Blanc, Captain Aimé Lemedec had stopped his engines. The ships were now perhaps a few hundred yards apart, still closing in a channel with no room left on the Dartmouth side. In the final moments, both bridges did what seemed safest, and the 2 choices combined into the worst possible one. Mackey and Lemedec, out of water to starboard, swung the Mont-Blanc hard to port, across the Imo's bow, gambling that the ships would pass starboard to starboard. For a moment, the gamble looked won. The ships were briefly parallel, and then the Imo, her bridge alarmed by the same closeness, rang full astern. A single propeller running astern walks a light, high-riding hull sideways. As the Imo gathered sternway, her head swung to starboard, into the gap, into the path the Mont-Blanc had just chosen. At about 8:45, the Imo's bow struck the Mont-Blanc's starboard side forward at little more than walking speed. As collisions go, it was minor. It opened a gash in the number 1 hold and canted some plates. It killed no one, and it did not even breach the hull below the waterline. Aboard almost any other ship in the harbour that morning, it would have meant an exchange of names and a season of paperwork. But the gash was in the hold below the stacked deck cargo, and as Captain Frome's engines dragged the Imo's bow back out of the wound, steel ground across steel and struck sparks. The collision had toppled and split benzol barrels on deck. The fuel ran across the deck and down into the torn hold, met the sparks, and lit. The fire took hold in seconds, fed by fuel spreading over a cargo of explosives, and the Mont-Blanc's crew understood immediately what no one else in the harbour did. There would be no fighting this fire, and no surviving it. Captain Lemedec ordered his ship abandoned. The crew went into the boats and pulled for the Dartmouth shore, shouting warnings as they went. The warnings were in French, into the noise of a working harbour, and the few men who heard them did not understand. The crew reached the shore and ran for the trees. Of the roughly 40 men aboard the most dangerous ship in North America, all but one would survive the morning. The one, a seaman struck by a blast fragment, died of his wounds afterward. It is the sharpest irony in this file. The only people in Halifax who knew exactly what was coming were the ones who got away from it. Their ship, burning and abandoned, did not stay in mid-channel. The current carried her gently across the Narrows toward the Halifax side, toward the busiest stretch of waterfront in the city, and she came to rest against Pier 6 in Richmond, with her fire climbing, and Halifax came to watch. This must be said plainly and without judgment, because no one watching had been told the truth. A burning ship was a spectacle in a town that lived by the sea, and this one burned spectacularly, the benzol sending up rolling black smoke shot with flashes as barrels burst high over the masts. Crowds gathered along the slips. Dock and factory workers climbed onto roofs for a better view. Children stopped on their way to school. And in the wooden houses climbing the Richmond slope, in offices, in schools, people crowded to their windows, hundreds of faces close against hundreds of panes of glass, all turned toward the harbour. The professionals converged on the fire, as professionals do. On Campbell Road, the street that ran along the Richmond waterfront, a grocer named Constant Upham could see the burning ship from his store, and his store had one of the neighborhood's few telephones. He rang the fire stations and reported a ship on fire at the piers, and the brigades turned out across the city. Halifax's first motorized engine, a new pumper named the Patricia, drew up near Pier 6, and her crew ran hose toward a ship fire they believed was a ship fire. Upham's call had done exactly what a good citizen's call should do. It had also, through no fault of his, summoned men to the one fire in the world they should have been running from. The harbour men closed in as well. The tug, Stella Maris, the same tug the Emo had crowded half an hour earlier, dropped her scows and came back down the Narrows toward the burning ship. Her master, Captain Horatio Brannan, first tried a hose, judged it useless, and began rigging a hawser to drag the Mont-Blanc off the pier before the fire could spread to the city. A whaler pulled over from the British cruiser Highflyer to help make the tow fast, and a steam pinnace put out from the old Canadian cruiser Niobe. Men were climbing aboard a ship they did not know was a bomb to save a waterfront that could not be saved. Up the hill at the Richmond yards, Vince Coleman tapped out his warning and stayed at his key. The overnight train from St. John was brought up short. Down the wire, other operators heard his message and then heard his line go silent. The fire burned for about 20 minutes. At 4 minutes and 35 seconds past 9, it reached the cargo. The Mont-Blanc ceased to exist. Nearly 3,000 tons of explosives went off as a single charge. The numbers can be stated, and here the numbers are the honest way to speak, because adjectives cannot hold this. The temperature at the heart of the blast reached thousands of degrees. The shock wave moved out through the city faster than sound, so that the north end was struck before it heard anything. The ship's steel was torn into fragments and rained across both towns for miles. The shank of her anchor, over half a ton of forged iron, came down more than 2 miles away on the far side of the peninsula. The barrel of one of her deck guns was found 3 miles in the other direction, near a Dartmouth lake. A column of smoke stood miles above the harbour. The blast was felt over 100 miles away, and windows broke 50 miles from Pier 6. The Richmond district, the slope that had gathered at its windows, took the shock wave first, then the falling steel, and then, along the shore, the sea itself. The explosion had shoved the water of the Narrows bodily aside, and it came back as a wave that ran up past the high water mark, drowned men on the piers, and all but erased the little Micmac community at Turtle Grove on the Dartmouth side. About 1,600 people were killed instantly. The toll passed 1,800 as the injured died, and some counts run closer to 2,000. 9,000 were injured. Around 25,000, half the city, were left without adequate shelter, with 1,600 buildings destroyed outright and 12,000 damaged. And because so many people had been standing at glass windows facing the harbour, the blast wrote a signature injury into the medical record. Hundreds of eye wounds from driven glass, dozens of people blinded outright, some in both eyes. The schools of the North End were filling for the morning. Whole classrooms died. Whole families in the wooden houses of Richmond died together when the buildings came down across their morning stoves and burned. It was and remains the deadliest single disaster in Canadian history. The dead of that morning include nearly every name this file has mentioned. Captain From of the Emo and his pilot, William Hayes, killed on their bridge as their ship was thrown ashore on the Dartmouth side. Captain Brannin of the Stella Maris and most of his crew. The whaler's men from the Highflyer, the pinnace crew from the Niobe. 9 firefighters at Pier 6, the crew of the Patricia, of whom only the driver, blown clear of his engine, survived. And Vince Coleman, at his telegraph key, found in the wreck of the Richmond office. His watch stopped a few minutes past 9. The train, he warned, was held short of the blast, and its passengers lived. His message had also done something he could not have planned. Because the wire from Halifax went dead after his last words, the operators down the line knew within minutes that something enormous had happened, and the railway began loading relief trains before the smoke had cleared the harbour. In the broken city, rescue began at once, and it began with the survivors themselves. Sailors from the ships in harbour, some from crews that had just lost half their strength, went into the collapsed streets. Soldiers came down from the garrison. The uninjured half of the city dug for the buried half with bare hands and fence rails. A soldier, following a faint sound, found a toddler, not yet 2 years old, alive beneath the ashpan of a stove whose iron had sheltered her when the house came down. Halifax would know her for the rest of her long life as Ashpan Annie. Then, rescue nearly stopped. Smoke rising near a magazine at the naval yard started a rumor of a second, larger explosion to come, and for a desperate stretch of the morning, rescuers were ordered back from the very streets where people lay trapped, until officers established that the magazine was safe. Some of the trapped burned before the diggers were allowed to return, and that night, on top of everything, the weather turned. A blizzard came in and dropped 16 inches of snow on a city of open cellars and missing walls, drifting through the rooms of houses that no longer had windows, while the ruins still smoked. The first help traveled down the telegraph wires, and then it came on rails. Trains from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick ran toward Halifax through the storm, carrying doctors and firemen from every town on the line, and from farther away came the response this file must record in full, because a century later it still shapes 2 cities. In Boston, the governor of Massachusetts had fragmentary first reports by mid-morning. He did not wait for details or for a request. A relief train left Boston that same night, carrying surgeons, nurses, and supplies, and bucked snowdrifts across Maine and New Brunswick to reach the city. Behind it came a steamer loaded with food, clothing, glass, and building materials, then money, medical staff, and reconstruction help that continued for months under the Massachusetts Halifax Relief Committee. Halifax has never treated that as a closed account. Since 1971, reviving a thank you first sent in 1918, Nova Scotia has sent Boston a Christmas tree every December, the official tree lit on Boston Common. It may be the gentlest tradition to come out of any disaster in this catalogue. Dartmouth, across the Narrows, carries its own count in this file, and it is often forgotten in the shadow of the larger one. The blast struck the smaller town almost as hard along its waterfront. Scores died there, among them most of the people of Turtle Grove, and the survivors of the Micmac community were dispersed, their settlement never rebuilt. When this episode says Halifax, it means both shores. The city itself organized with a speed that had a grim explanation. Halifax had done mass casualty work before. 5 years earlier, the ships that recovered the dead of the Titanic had sailed from this harbour, and the same officials and the same funeral firm had built the mortuary system that identified them. Those procedures came off the shelf, and the same curling rink became a morgue again, with the same numbered bag system that had matched the Titanic's dead to their effects now matching a city's dead to theirs. On the 17th of December, 11 days after the blast, the first mass funeral was held for the unidentified, coffins in rows in an open square, the service read in falling snow. A relief commission took charge of food, shelter, medical care, and in time, pensions, and it would go on paying survivors of this one morning until 1976. The eye injuries left their own long mark. Hundreds of wounded eyes arriving in a single day forced surgeons into an intensity of ophthalmic work that peacetime never demands, and the care of the blinded survivors helped drive the founding, the following year, of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. Out of one morning of shattered window glass, Halifax became, for a generation, a centre of eye medicine and of services for blind Canadians. It is a real inheritance and a hard-bought one. Within a week, while streets were still being cleared, a court began asking why. The Wreck Commissioner's inquiry opened on the 13th of December under Justice Arthur Drysdale, in a city that was burying its dead and wanted a name to blame. Testimony ran for weeks. The pilots, the surviving officers, the naval staff, the whistle signals reconstructed blast by blast. The IMO's counsel was aggressive. The mood in the room was hostile to the French ship, and the finding, delivered in February, gave the city what it wanted. Drysdale laid the disaster entirely on the Mont-Blanc, on Captain Lemedic, on Pilot Mackey, and on Commander Wyatt, the examining officer who controlled harbour movements. All three were charged with manslaughter. The rule the inquiry leaned on was the oldest one in the Channel: keep to your own water and never turn across another ship's bow. The Mont-Blanc had made the final turn to port, and the Mont-Blanc had exploded, and in the winter of 1918, that was enough. It did not survive the higher courts. A judge examining the manslaughter charges found no evidence to send Lemedic or Mackey to trial, and when Wyatt alone was tried that spring, a jury acquitted him in under a day. The civil suit between the two ships' owners went up on appeal, and in 1919, the Supreme Court of Canada split the blame equally between the ships. The owners appealed again to the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, the highest court in the Empire, and in 1920 it delivered the final word. Both ships were navigated badly, and the fault was equal. The IMO had been in the wrong water, out of position after 2 irregular passings, and, on the weight of the evidence, moving too fast. The Mont-Blanc had answered with the fatal turn across her bow. The disaster belonged to both bridges. The people the first inquiry had named went their separate ways, none of them to prison. Captain Lemedic returned to France, where his own service cleared him, and he went back to sea, ending his career a decorated master. Francis Mackey, the pilot, spent years fighting for the return of his license, got it, and piloted ships in and out of Halifax harbour for the rest of his working life, maintaining to the end that his ship had been in her own water. Commander Wyatt, acquitted, left the Canadian Navy and the country. The Emo herself was salvaged from the Dartmouth shore, repaired and renamed. 4 years after the Narrows, she ran aground in the Falkland Islands and was wrecked, this time with no city beside her. A century of analysis has mostly endorsed that flat, unsatisfying verdict, and has added the deeper findings the courts were never asked to make. The rule required dangerous cargoes to be flagged, anchored apart, and moved under control. In Halifax that winter, a munitions ship entered a crowded channel unmarked, unescorted, and unannounced to the city around her because wartime secrecy had quietly dissolved the peacetime safeguards. The rule required the harbour authority to govern movements. Commander Wyatt would testify that his warnings about uncontrolled traffic in the Narrows had gone unanswered by his superiors, and the practice of holding inbound munitions ships until the channel cleared existed on paper without being applied. The rule limited harbour speed to 5 knots. Witnesses put the IMO above it. No single villain survives examination. What the record shows instead is a system wound tight by 3 years of war, moving explosives daily through a half-mile funnel between 2 towns, with its margins quietly spent, waiting for one bad morning of whistles. The rebuilding began within weeks and left a monument you can walk through. North of the ruined district, the Relief Commission built hundreds of new homes in hydro-pressed concrete block, fireproof, laid out around shared greens by town planners brought in for the purpose. The neighbourhood is called the Hydrostone, and it stands today, solid and lived in, on the slope where Richmond burned. The rules changed the way rules change after such files. Harbour traffic control in Halifax was tightened immediately. Munitions ships thereafter moved under escort, with the channel held clear under an authority whose orders were enforceable. The lesson travelled. The handling of dangerous cargo in ports, its declaration, its segregation, its right-of-way, hardened over the following decades into the international conventions that now keep such ships announced and controlled rather than anonymous in a crowd. The Mont-Blanc's anonymity had been meant to protect her from submarines. It had instead disarmed every safeguard ashore. The modern rule is the opposite one. A port must know what is inside the hulls it hosts, and so must the people who work beside them. And the blast itself became a reference. The scientists who built the atomic bomb studied Halifax as the best available measure of what a very large explosion does to a built city. The largest accidental explosion of the old world became a baseline for the deliberate ones of the new, which is a heavy thing for one morning in Nova Scotia to carry. On the hill above the rebuilt North End at Fort Needham, a memorial tower now holds bells that ring out over the Narrows every 6th of December at a ceremony the city has kept for more than a century, timed to the minute of the blast. The names the city remembers would fill a town. The children of the Richmond schools, the families of the wooden houses, the Micmac families of Turtle Grove. Captain Brannan and the crew of the Stella Maris, who died trying to tow the fire away from everyone else. The 9 firefighters of the Patricia who answered an alarm no one had told them the truth about. And 1 railway dispatcher who saw the fire, understood it, sent his warning, and stayed. Vince Coleman's pocket watch is in the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, a few minutes past 9 forever. The train he warned came in late and full and safe. The Empress of Ireland went down in Canadian waters 3 years before this morning in another collision that 2 crews described 2 different ways. That investigation is the companion to this one.